It's the middle of April 1983. We're in Australia's old Parliament building where the captains of industry and the bosses of unions finally meet after over a decade of bitter conflict. The summit is being held together by the state, embodied at this moment by one man, Bob Hawke. This looks like two sides coming together and sitting down for an agreement, but in reality, this summit is the high point of a coup, one that has been in the works for years. The coup didn't happen after dramatic revolutionary battles, but through mundane meetings behind closed doors like this summit. Rebel unions like the Builders Labourers Federation would try to fight this coup and were on strike the day of the summit, but ultimately they were too late. The consequences of this coup are long-standing, many of which still permeate Australia to this very day. But perhaps the most interesting yet least discussed fact is how the union movement was at the vanguard of this coup, a coup which would ultimately permanently debilitate the union movement, relegating it from a major influence in social life. Today, Australian life is characterised by its housing crisis, incredibly inflated house prices underpinned by globally high household debt and an unusually sophisticated financial system. But by the end of World War II, Australia was stuck in a different kind of housing crisis.
What has it become in recent years? The headquarters of irresponsible socialists, a house of disruption. In the meantime, homes are scarce, living costs extortionate.
The then Chifley Labour government was busy fighting to control a communist rebellion in the unions. From August 1945 until the end of 1947, 9 communist-led unions representing only 26% of the workforce were responsible for 84% of strikes. And as expected, this drew the ire of the Labour government.
We will use the army on them. We will use the navy on them. And the air force. They are scum, and if it's left to me, to the concentration camp they'll go.
Despite the communists losing, they ended up taking Chifley with them. In 1949, Robert Menzies' Liberal Party won a landslide election. Menzies implemented a wide raft of sweeping reforms, which in totality made it easier for working-class Australians to purchase houses and become homeowners. This was an explicitly anti-communist reaction, capable of absorbing the working class, of annulling its more radical tendencies and the demands it might make.
Just as the communist powers and their overseas friends will work incessantly to divide.
And it worked. Union membership declined, Communist Party membership declined, home ownership grew, and for 2 decades, the Liberal government ruled federally, uninterrupted. But by the late 1960s, the Liberal post-war order was beginning to show its cracks. House prices had increased beyond wages, which caused home ownership to fall, and there was a long-term decline in profitability, debt capacity, and liquidity in the dominant manufacturing sector. The government relaxed financial restrictions in response, making it easier to borrow money, but this only incentivized investors to take on debt they could only pay back if asset prices grew substantially, or what economist Hyman Minsky called Ponzi finance. The structural downturn in post-war capitalism came with an upsurge in union activity. In the first 2 months of 1968, metalworkers engaged in over 400 strikes, which at their height consisted of over 180,000 workers walking off the job. But undoubtedly, the flashpoint was the jailing of the Secretary of the Tramways Union, Clary O'Shea, in 1969. The response from the union movement was a general strike where 1 million Australian workers walked off the job in protest of Shea's jailing. Throughout the 1970s, there was a resurgence in union density and an explosion in the rate of strikes. But these weren't just random strikes just happening to coincide. There was a definitive social movement, one of militant unionism, but also of feminism, First Nations rights, environmentalism, and anti-imperialism. This movement was successful in ousting the Liberal Party in favour of Labour's Gough Whitlam in the 1972 election, a watershed moment in Australian politics. But there is one thing that's missing. That is Bob Hawke, then president of the Australian Council of Trade Unions. Hawke first got his gig as a research officer at the ACTU, climbing the ranks until he was elected president in 1969. The election of Hawke, alongside the climate of elevated union militancy, for the time represented a shift in the ACTU away from its conservative leadership. But despite enjoying important backing from the left-wing and communist unions, Hawke was hiding something.
Mr. Hawke, you come into office with some considerable power attached to your new position. Are there any particular things you'd like to see developed in your new office?
Throughout his time at the ACTU, Hawke frequently conversated with US intelligence operators. Occasionally in these conversations, Hawke would denigrate various unions as industrial idiots and disclose information about their long-term financial viability. Indeed, the ACTU executive had become significantly more conservative by 1977. Despite Hawke's best efforts though, the left wing of the union movement maintained its militancy, essentially making laws punishing unions for striking null and void. If any court or government attempted to put a union boss in jail for industrial action, there was the implicit threat of another Shea-inspired general strike. Australia was engulfed in a class war. And for a time, the unions were winning. The rate of profit was tumbling downwards, inflation was in the double digits, and yet unions won wage increases that outpaced inflation, reductions in the workdays, and major social programs from the Whitlam government. Democratic control and oversight of work sites, never seen before on this scale in Australia, began popping up as many workers were realising their power as a class. But for the capitalist mode of production, this arrangement was untenable. Combined with a global crisis sparked by major oil producers embargoing exports to their previous colonial overlords, post-war capitalism was reaching a breaking point. As such, for any political party seeking to govern through the capitalist state, like that of the Labour Party, this situation was likewise untenable. To quote Whitlam in 1975, it raises special difficulties for a democratic socialist party. We find ourselves now in a position of seeking ways of restoring profitability. We have to do that if we are to restore full employment. But despite Whitlam's late conservatising and his Liberal Party successor Malcolm Fraser's overt union bashing, Australian society and its economy remain quagmired in the struggle between capital and labour.
If they are going to withhold supply, they should take notice of the fact that the Australian trade union movement may very well think about withholding supplies.
The more radical nature of the union movement had dissipated significantly since the mid-1970s, and industrial campaigns largely lost their political character. It's worth noting that the unions in the late 1970s and early 1980s were in a much weaker position than they were in the late 60s and early 70s. Nonetheless, there remained a heightened level of strikes, as for the unions, it was the most effective way to maintain living standards for their workers. If inflation went up, or if the Fraser government tried instituting a wage freeze, workers would just go on strike and demand higher wages and better conditions, and would often win. But importantly for capital, the rate of profit never recovered, and for Australia's economy domestically dominated by manufacturing, this would lay the grounds for a major paradigm change. If we go back to Hawke's relationship with the Americans, we can see it went beyond conversation. In 1974, Hawke and his contacts would discuss a tripartite committee of unions, business, and the government as a way to cohere all three into acting in the same interest. Of course, because this tripartite committee was capitalist in nature, the goal was the preservation of the capitalist mode of production. And in the context of an elevated class conflict, this would come in the form of the union movement controlled, and capital restructured and unleashed. But for this tripartite committee to work, there needed to be buy-in and participation from the three different sides. The most difficult faction to co-opt were of course the unions, particularly the communist-led unions, who were the most militant in ignoring the government and opposing capital. This is where Bob Hawke comes in, through what the Americans praise as a little here, little there de-radicalizing approach. He and other conservative forces within the union movement slowly but surely steered it towards a more passive pathway. Under Bob Hawke's leadership, the ACTU's democratic processes had been hollowed out, with it merely acting as a rubber stamp for decisions predetermined by factional deals behind Labour Party doors. As such, when Hawke began gathering support for a tripartite deal, the consultation and coordination that did occur primarily happened in the upper echelons, within the nexus of Labour Party factions and relevant senior union bureaucrats. Jenny Haynes, a delegate from the Nurses Union in New South Wales, advised that the only consultation that she was aware of occurred within and between the right and left factions of the Labor Party. In fact, the vast bulk of union members, and therefore a majority of Australian society, did not thoroughly discuss and vote on this idea. Haynes's concerns were shared by many even in the union bureaucracy. The policies were initially negotiated between the factions and interests at the ACTU executive level, and the Congress had become little more than a rubber stamp for executive recommendations. The principal point of policy formulation and negotiation of trade union interests lied within the ACTU executive, which, because of the hierarchical structure of Australian unionism, was an elite group. But after years of backroom deals, Hawke's coup within the unions would be successful. The ACTU Congress in 1982 would pass what would become known as the Prices and Incomes Accord, an agreement between the Australian Labor Party and the union movement. The essence of the agreement was as follows. If elected into power, the Labor Party would legislate a significant boost to the social safety net, for example, reinstating universal healthcare, otherwise known as the social wage. In return, and this was crucial, the unions would give up their most vital weapon and cease all strike action to allow the Labor Party to govern and reform over the capitalist economy effectively. On top of the Accord being the result of elite policymaking, the Labor Party didn't issue the Accord as some kind of introduction to constructive dialogue, but rather as an ultimatum. Then leader of the Labor Party, Bill Hayden, told the 1982 conference that without the Accord, the federal parliamentary Labor Party would have at their disposal only fiscal and monetary measures, quite brutal and severe in their impact, which in this context was slashing social programs and freezing wages as a means to fight persistent inflation. Since the 1970s, the right-wing union leadership had been on board with cooperation between the government and the trade unions. But this wasn't the case for those really important communist unions, namely the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union and the Builders Workers Industrial Union, the former the largest union in Australia at this point. It became paramount to Hawke and the Labor Party then to bring them into the fold. There were numerous factors which brought the communist union leadership to the table. 1, the economic conditions had deteriorated significantly, and 2, they weren't winning industrial campaigns like they were in the early 70s. The union bureaucracy was more stable and found it safer in coordinating accord-like agreements with peak bodies of particular industries, as opposed to militant industrial campaigns which empowered the rank and file. As such, the activity of unions like the AMWU were already shifting away from the shop floor to bureaucratic pen-pushing work. The locus of power and activity went from strike action driven by the rank-and-file on-the-floor workers to how well a particular bureaucrat could manage their worksite and maintain constructive relationships with the employer. Crucially though, the Accord was pitched to these unions as a democratic road to socialism via this safe, bureaucratic activity as opposed to militant unionism. Both incomes, labour, and prices, capital, were to be regulated. Wealth would be redistributed equitably, local industry protected, and unions are part of a consensus-built national policy. This framing was required to get key unions on board. Convincing the communist-led union leadership that the Accord was some kind of path to socialism was necessary, and indeed, the secretary of the AMWU, Laurie Carmichael, saw the Accord as an opportunity to blast international capital. According to Humphreys 2018, the AMWU was at the leading edge of industrial struggle, with the gains it made in shop floor industrial action often flowing onto other segments of the working class. The consent of the AMWU for the Accord was key to ensuring the establishment and implementation of the Accord. Without the sanction and ongoing support of the AMWU, the Accord could not have been cohered. Months after the Accord was ratified, Bob Hawke, who had been elected to Parliament in 1980, led the Labor Party to a historic victory in the 1983 election. By cohering the unions and their various factions all behind the Prices and Incomes Accord, Hawke was able to put the final piece of the puzzle together and finish the coup with the National Economic Summit.
I have the greatest pleasure in welcoming all participants and observers to this historic National Economic Summit conference. We meet here today as the representatives of the Australian people.
So far, we've only spoken about the relationship between the party and the Labor side of the equation. This has been characterised by subversive espionage, backroom factional deals, behind closed-door decision-making, and strict ultimatums that all culminated in debilitating the rank-and-file's most powerful and democratic weapon, the ability to strike. Whereas the unions were told by the party what was going to happen whether or not they got on board, the dynamic between the party and capital was much more of a working relationship with ongoing dialogue, and therefore much less formal. Treasury officials would dominate both the Labor Parliamentary Caucus and the Federal Public Service, consisting predominantly of privately educated economics undergrads from universities which taught neoclassical economic theory as a doctrine. The Treasurer himself, Paul Keating, would surround himself with a series of Treasury officials and senior economic journalists, particularly from the Financial Review, and moreover, the Business Council really did have a big influence on the government all the way through.
The government prevailing on those issues really meant the almost, not complete, but to a degree, a large annihilation of the left wing of the Labor Party.
The 1983 National Economic Summit was the congregation where all members to the tripartite, the unions, the Labor government and capital met and deliberated national policy. Notably, numerous union delegates picked up on a very different tone to the original accord, the agreement signed between just the Labor Party and the unions. Where the accord stressed redistribution, protection, and welfare, the National Economic Summit discussed only strict macroeconomic outcomes surrounding productivity and profitability. Regardless, the Hawke government upheld their promise regarding one of the biggest demands of the left unions, the introduction of Medicare. But the most important development was the integration of the unions into the state via the Accord and the Summit. As mentioned, many unions were already bureaucratizing by the late 1970s, shifting towards navigating corporate relationships over shop floor organizing. The integration of unions into state-centric processes, which required resources to navigate and uphold, cemented the bureaucratic nature of even the most militant unions. In order to enter the Accord, the AMWU began to devote its resources and intellectual capacities to an alliance with the Labor government, a decision that abnegated or rejected those previously democratic and mobilisational features. For example, the AMWU played an important role in winning support for the Accord within rank-and-file networks. It organised education sessions on the Accord. The union also printed and distributed copies of the Accord within the Labor movement, and after the ALP was elected, distributed speakers' notes to assist with prosecuting arguments in support of it. As put conclusively by Humphreys, the more that union leaders' entry into higher level and state-centric processes led to the hollowing out of union organisation, the more their own influence rested not on the social power of organised labour, the rank and file, the actual working class, but on their ability to manoeuvre within the state and political sphere. The Accord therefore demobilised the unions via integrating them within state, political, and partisan institutions. Union bureaucrats thereafter derived their power and standing from their ability to navigate and negotiate with the state, as opposed to from the actual rank and file and industrial activity. To the unions at this time, they actually believed that this represented the pinnacle of trade union power in Australia. They were saying that Vladimir Lenin could only dream of this. But as they would find out, the Accord and the institutional prestige that it brought would ultimately be a poisoned chalice. The consequence of bureaucratisation and giving up the right to strike would prove a fatal blow to Australian unionism. Fundamentally, what gives a union of workers leverage over their employer is the fact that they perform labour necessary to the production of goods and services. Without that labour, the company can't sell commodities and make a profit. Thus, the ability for workers to withdraw their labour, i.e. go on strike, is what makes unions what they are. So when union leaders permanently give up the right to strike, and therefore the source of union power under the Accord, the invariable result was deunionisation. Over the Accord era, the number of union delegates proportionate to employees fell by 19%, and while there are many places in the developed world where union membership plummeted, Australia's membership fall was the most extreme. However, there was still one thorn in the Labor Party's side: Norm Gallagher and the Builders Labourers Federation. See, there were two construction worker unions in the 1980s, the Builders Workers Industrial Union and the Builders Labourers Federation. Both were led by communists, but that's probably where their allegiances ended. By the 1980s, the BWIU was closely aligned with the Hawke government and highly supportive of the Accord, whereas the BLF wanted to retain its independence and militancy, naturally bucking with the quote consensus of the Accord. Indeed, on the day of the National Economic Summit, BLF workers were on strike. The BLF would continue as it did prior to the Accord, calling numerous strikes in the first few years of the Hawke government. This would draw the ire of both the federal government and state governments, particularly in New South Wales and Victoria, resulting in the union's deregistration in 1986. But for a union already skirting the law, deregistration itself wasn't the final blow. What killed the BLF was the BWIU, alongside conservative unions like the AWU, providing scab labour to companies bargaining with the BLF and would use their legal registration as unions to enter previously BLF worksites.
Each individual worker was taken with two police into a room where there was an official of the Building Workers Industrial Union and an official from the Department of Labour, a state government department, and that worker was then told he had to sign one form, which was to resign from the BLF, and another form, which was to join the BWIU. Now, the workforce on that job in particular were terrorised. I mean, there's no doubt about it. They come from places where you didn't, in a confrontation with a large number of policemen, go on too much about your civil rights and stuff. You merely either, well, you kowtowed, really.
Builders labourers did themselves an absolute treat on umpteen different jobs. I mean, against all sorts of odds. There were poaching union officials down there, there were garrisons of police. Half the Victoria Police Force were on call to stand over builders labourers whose only crime was to want to go to work and to defend their union.
BLF organisers were jailed, fined and banned from their work sites, state governments would seize BLF assets, and respective trades halls would expel the BLF from being affiliates. With the BLF isolated and depleted, all serious threats were eliminated and the previously most militant unions completely co-opted. In the end, the BLF and the BWIU would merge and amalgamate into one big union, today known as the CFMEU. Where does this leave us today? The union movement's purpose in Australia is primarily an appendage of the Parliamentary Labor Party. It operates as a campaign outfit, a space for networking and career progression, and remains integrated within Labor factions. This requires a sprawling, unaccountable web of bureaucracy, upheld by a minimised rank and file, which is haunted by past spectres. Just over 10% of Australians are a member of their union, and the ability to strike is heavily regulated under the Fair Work Act. We have seen an uptick in activity over the past year or so, and it has the potential to be something promising. Nonetheless, the legacy of Hawke's coup remains pervasive, and will remain for any rank and file movement the biggest challenge ahead.